Hello, my name is Bruce Tift, and I'd like to welcome you to this series of discussions on the dialogue between a Buddhist view and a psychotherapy view about how we might free ourselves of unnecessary suffering and experience a freedom that is already present in our lives. I really enjoyed talking about this material, and I hope it's useful for you. Perhaps you could ask yourselves if you want to be free. If so, I think that suggests that we don't already experience feeling free. Why would we not already feel free unless there were some obstacle, some problem? So when we're talking about liberation, we're usually implying that there's some experience of imprisonment, something we want to resolve or remove in order to experience freedom. And that's a major theme of our discussion in these programs, is what in fact might be the nature of any obstacle. What is the cause, the source of feeling imprisoned in our lives? Is our immediate experiencing actually problematic? And if so, is it because of our life circumstances, because of unresolved issues from our history? Or perhaps it may arise from how we relate to our experience. The first view is basically that of Western psychotherapy, that there are actual difficulties in how we experience our lives, how we organize our experience, and our goal is basically to improve our sense of self, improve how we relate skillfully to our life circumstances, so that we can feel more free, more satisfied, more engaged. And those circumstances, of course, are, in therapy, mostly inner circumstances. The historic conditioning that we still have to deal with, our life experiences that have affected us. There's this continual display of experiencing that all of us must deal with. We have no choice. It's endless. It's not perhaps resolvable. But the therapy view is pretty much that we want to improve this display. We want to improve our sense of self, our skill in engaging with our life. A Buddhist view is more that how we relate to whatever we're experiencing, whether positive or negative, is even more important than what we're experiencing. Obviously, it's very important for most of us, whether we're healthy or sick, whether we're in poverty or have adequate money, whether we have to deal with depression or have a sense of well-being. But a Buddhist view is that how we relate to all of these experiences is actually more impactful on our state of mind. In my personal life and as a therapist, I've found that both views are very helpful, very important. I often find that some people have a tendency to appreciate therapy and be cautious about a spiritual path. Some people are very invested in spiritual path and somewhat cynical about therapy. My experience is that both are very valuable, but in ways that can never really be integrated into one view or resolved into a certain formula. And it's this very lack of resolution that I find most interesting to work with. The ideas, the views, the practices that we'll be discussing in these sessions all arise from my personal work and my personal experience. I remember when I was quite young that it became clear to me that it wasn't going to be too helpful for me to just take on other people's ideas. That even though I might feel doubt about certain ideas or approaches that I was exploring, that it just felt obviously the right way to go, to base my work, my life, my practices on what personally had made sense, what was personally useful. When I was in my 20s, I began a clinical psychology program, and after 1 year stopped. Actually, I almost ran out screaming. I was horrified at what felt like an attitude that anyone training to become a doctor in psychology was by definition sane. Anybody in the client chair was by definition neurotic or worse. I left the country, spent a couple of years abroad, and met the Tibetan community in exile in India and became very interested in Tibetan Buddhism. When I returned, I met my teacher, Trungpa Rinpoche, and eventually found a way back into my interest in therapy through my practice and understanding of Buddhism. So my passion for the last 30-some years has been to find a way to use what is most skillful and useful about therapy, along with what is most skillful and useful in Buddhism, and to find a way to bring these two together because they're both so powerful, and they both really focus on a certain range of phenomena. Neither addresses everything. So in these series of discussions, my hope is to have a dialogue between these two approaches and to talk a bit about how I have used both views as an ongoing dialogue between the two, an ongoing interaction that will never be resolved, but I find very rich and to be, I believe, very useful for many of the people that I've worked with. The basic view of Western therapy is, of course, very congruent with our Western culture. Our Western culture has an idea that a better quality of life comes from improving one's sense of self and one's life circumstances. There's obviously a lot that's very accurate about that. Better health, adequate money, political freedoms, learning to feel positive about oneself. Those are all wonderful qualities. And in our culture, we associate many of those positive experiences with a state of freedom. One of the possible problems, of course, is that when we place our experience of freedom in external circumstances and even inner states of mind, which we don't really have full control over, there's always a certain tentative quality to our experience of freedom. A Buddhist view approaches the experience of freedom with the assertion that it's how we relate to our experience, whatever it is, whether we like it or don't like it, whether we feel depressed or happy, whether we're in good health or poor health. Those are all very important, of course, but how we relate to our experience turns out to be even more important. And the experience of freedom arises from a willingness to be completely committed to our life, whatever it is, at any moment. So many of us, of course, want to be free. We want to feel whole. We want to feel at peace. In what way is our experience of freedom dependent on our life circumstances, our states of mind? In what way is our experience of freedom arising from our unconditional commitment to the truth of our experience? In these discussions, we'll go back and forth between these two views. Both have their value, both have their limitations. We're going to be going through 7 sessions in this program. The first will be an overview of the core Western metaphor of the developmental view. The idea that what we have experienced as young children growing up has been profoundly impactful in terms of our strategies for engaging with our life, for taking the best care of ourselves possible. The next session will be on the fruitional view, which is arising from the Buddhist idea that anything that we're going to find as far as our own basic nature has to be present in this immediate moment. If it's our basic nature, it's not something we're going to find in the future. And so a lot of Buddhist practices are deconstructive. They're about how to go deeper and deeper into immediacy and find out what is most true, actually. The next session will be an exploration about the dialogue, the back and forth nature of working from a developmental view and a fruitional view in clinical work. The next section is focused on anxiety and struggle. And I find that our experience of anxiety is right at the heart of most of the ways in which we generate unnecessary suffering for ourselves and for others. And so for me, it's incredibly helpful to start to be curious about our immediate experience of anxiety and how we might work with this very disturbing experience. That's actually just part of being human. Our anxiety turns out not to be a problem, it's just very difficult to work with. The next discussion is on body awareness, and as I said, I find the practice of staying in our immediate embodied experience central to our capacity to not get too fascinated and captured by all of our ideas and formulas about how to live our life. Most of us tend to take our ideas as actually being descriptions of reality, but I don't think that's actually accurate, and it's usually not helpful. So just as there might be a dialogue between a developmental view and a Buddhist view, also I think it's very helpful to have an ongoing dialogue between our thinking about our experience and our immediate embodied experiencing. The last two sessions will be on relationships. As I said, I find relationship so provocative, so rich, that it's extremely difficult to pretend that we have our lives together when we're in an intimate relationship. It's a lot easier to feel that we're on top of things, we're in control in some way, if we're off on a meditation retreat or at work. But when we're at home and the kids are yelling and we're worrying about money and our partner's not who we want them to be, that's where we really get to test our practice and see if our practice is actually helping us keep our hearts open. So in each of these discussions, I'll do my best to continually refer back to how we might address these central human concerns from the point of view that our basic nature is already that of freedom. And we'll discuss some of the reasons why we may not consciously be participating in this experience, and some of the ways which we might use to invite this experience into our awareness. My hope is that these discussions will be useful, provocative, and practical, whether you happen to be a clinician working with clients, whether you're someone who's interested in Buddhism, interested in therapy, interested in the dialogue between the two. And so, of course, I hope that you continually check out the ideas and see if they are, in fact, relevant to your experience and useful. The first discussion will be to explore the developmental view, which is central to Western psychotherapy's approach to how to relieve unnecessary suffering. It's based on the idea that the experiences we have as children, mostly in our families of origin, are profoundly impactful in our strategies to survive, first of all, and to have the best quality of life possible. Because these responses that we make, these formulas or strategies we come up with, are usually very intelligent, very appropriate, they tend to become habitual and to persist because they work. Because these strategies are often in response to very disturbing, difficult, even dangerous realities, they're usually associated with quite a bit of anxiety. And so these strategies usually operate out of awareness once established. An important understanding, in my experience, is to clarify that the developmental view is not actually about the past. It sounds that way, but it's really about how most of us, in a variety of ways, are living as if the present were the past, as if we were still young children in our families of origin. And this is especially true in the realm of relationships. It's as if we were acting a role in a play, but we got a lot of good response from it, it works, and we've done it so long now, we've done it for decades, that we've even forgotten that we're playing a role. We've forgotten that we're in a drama, that we actually have a larger sense of self, a larger life. So my understanding of the developmental view is that basically we're working with ourselves and others to understand how we are continuing to live in the present moment as if we were still in the past. If that's what's happening, and I believe it's happening for most of us, certainly myself included, then of course it makes sense to do a good job of this drama that we're in rather than a bad job. And Western psychotherapy has a variety of techniques, theories, approaches that help somebody improve the story that they're telling about themselves, the drama that they play. The potential problem, of course, is that as we focus on the past to clarify our formulas for engaging in the present, it's very easy to assume that we're actually talking about the past. And so, of course, many people try to rework their past. You can't rework your past, of course. Any of our memories about the past are speculative, incomplete, partial, and even more potentially problematic if we somehow believe that the past is causing the present, then we've positioned ourselves subtly as powerless victims, because we can't actually, of course, change the past. When I'm working with clients, I am always curious about their history. I want to know something about their family of origin experience, siblings, life experiences. But personally, I don't really worry if somebody doesn't want to go into their past, which many clients don't, because it doesn't really matter. We're always talking about how we are engaging in our present moment. And the present moment, in my experience, is the only moment in which we can effectively intervene. It's the only moment that we're actually experiencing our life. So, in this discussion, I'm going to talk a little bit about the metaphor of metabolism, which might help explain how we end up with an experience of being divided against our own selves, and the sense of dilemma that comes from that. I'm going to talk a bit about the nature of neurosis, about our claim of being problematic people, about the nature of change, give some examples of specific types of ways of working from this view, and also talk a little bit about a progression of work in which we can gradually dissolve our fantasy of being divided against our own self. The metaphor of metabolism, of course, comes from the idea of eating food for our energy, our growth. We have to eat. And when we eat, we have to be able to make use of what we eat, or it's not going to help us survive, grow, have energy. So metabolism has to do with our capacity to digest what we eat, and we're always eating our experience. Aldous Huxley has a quote, "Experience is not what happens to you, but what you do with what happens to you." It's how we process experience that seems to be most important as far as being able to make use of our experience. As infants, young children, even in the womb, we rely on our parents to digest our experience for us. Metaphorically, again, it's almost like a mother bird that would digest the worm and then spit it back up for the babies. Our parents have to digest experience, the realities of life for the young infant. It's too much otherwise. Just like a parent would not give a 1-month-old solid food. It's not that solid food is a problem. It's just that the baby can't digest it. So the parents need to buffer the child from too much intensity, to interpret experience, to hold literally, figuratively that child, protect them, to help them feel unconditionally loved, safe. All of these external ego functions provide the child with an adequate sense of safety and well-being, feeling loved, feeling they have a place in the world. Of course, all parents, I'm a parent, we're all limited. We do our best for our children, but it's always limited, and all children will have to deal with some experience that is just too much, cannot be digested, cannot be processed because of our incapacity, our immaturity as little beings. If it's not too much, then we handle it quite adequately. Some therapists would call that an adequate holding environment. And when we are held by our life, by our parents, by our world adequately, we actually can rest in being a mystery to ourselves. Every moment we can show up not having to know who we are or how we're going to handle the next moment. That, of course, is an ideal experience out of which to grow, because every moment is fresh, everything is an experiment. But for most of us, it's just a matter of degree to which we have to come up with our own formulas to protect, process, defend against overwhelming experiences of grief, fear, rage, panic, physical discomfort, abandonment, just the experiences of being a young human. One of the fundamental ways in which we protect ourselves as young infants, as young children, is to do our best to not have to consciously participate in what is most terrifying or overwhelming. The developmental view is that we make a variety of efforts growing up, and by the ages of 4, 5, 6 years old, we are finally capable of the achievement of what's called a neurotic level of organization, which really means that we're able to stabilize our repressive capacities. We're able to somewhat, in an ongoing way, push out of our awareness feelings that are just too disturbing to handle, to digest, to make use of. For example, in my family, I was eldest and a male, of course, with parents who valued independence and were somewhat phobic around the energy of dependency. So my best understanding and my current style suggests that it was very smart for me to learn to not feel dependent. If I felt dependent, I would act dependent. If I acted dependent, bad things would happen. I would be pushed away, perhaps, or love would be withheld, or my parents would get anxious, or whatever. I can't remember the specifics, so it's somewhat speculative, but I think it's pretty clear that for me it was very healthy and functional to learn to not feel like a dependent person. That allowed me to receive approval, love, to fit into our family, and, of course, it had its own benefits out in the world. The price tag, however, was that I had to find a way to never feel dependent. Anytime I felt dependent, that would be associated with a type of survival level panic. In my experience with working with people, I find that almost all of us turn out to have an annihilatory level of panic associated with our core vulnerabilities. Because as children, I think, our actual emotional survival often was at stake, and sometimes even our physical safety. So, we're a young child, we actually have somehow figured out how to not feel overwhelmed by intense feelings we don't know how to handle and our environment is not handling for us. What an incredible achievement. That's not pathological. It's very healthy. It's very appropriate. It's wonderful to be able to have that capacity. It allows us then to go out into the world, which coincidentally is when most of us go out into the world as far as school, about that age, because we're able to act in sort of a stabilized, socially approved way, most of us. However, there's a price tag, of course, that is part of this achievement. The price tag is that we have managed to push out of our awareness a very disturbing part of who we are that we don't know how to handle. But pushing that part of ourself out of awareness does not, of course, make it go away. So, for example, if someone grows up, as I did, learning to not feel dependent, it doesn't mean that as a little child I wasn't dependent. Of course, I was incredibly dependent, and I had a very strong motivation to never be aware of feeling dependent. So there's a price tag, meaning that to the extent that this strategy worked, became sort of structural, was put into unconsciousness, and then persisted into adulthood, on a relative level, of course, I would have difficulty dealing with being a dependent person. And as we'll talk about in our discussion of relationships, it's very, very common that we will mysteriously end up with partners who manifest exactly what we have disowned in ourselves, and vice versa. But there's a deeper price tag that I'm especially interested in working with as a therapist, which is that we end up feeling divided against ourselves. We feel there's a part of ourself that is problematic and even dangerous, perhaps shameful or embarrassing or unworthy of love from others. So we have achieved this amazing capacity to fit into our emotional world, our unique family system, our culture, gender, so forth. But there's a very big price tag to pay, which is that we end up feeling that somehow there's something wrong with me, something that's a problem about who I am, and I have to never go there, never have a relationship with that part of me, that part of my experiencing. If we imagine being a little child standing out in the world and feeling threatened, we might put up a wall for protection, or even put ourselves in a little box for protection. That helps, but then, of course, the next impulse will be to claim that we want to feel connected with everything, with life. We don't want to feel alienated and disconnected from life. But we don't understand at that moment that we're the ones choosing to, for very good reasons, put the wall there. It's not happening to us. So the very success of our efforts to protect ourselves lead to inevitably an experience of being divided against oneself and, on an external level, alienated from life, not trustful of life. Because, of course, life can make us feel those feelings at any moment. So something that I find all the time in my work that I think there's not enough discussion about or awareness of is that we all seem, as adults, to want to resolve our neuroses, resolve our limitations, but we don't understand that we have an incredible investment in maintaining them, in maintaining our young survival strategies, because they were put into place for our own survival and well-being and protection. And it's not until we actually can investigate in a very immediate, embodied way whether these protective strategies are still required. Until we can do that work, we're going to constantly look for evidence that proves that our survival strategies are still required, necessary, and justified. Most of us are not aware of this sort of paradox, that as adults, consciously, we genuinely want to relieve ourselves of the suffering, the price tag that these patterns carry with them. But at an even deeper level, most of us are even more invested in making sure that we never have to give up these survival strategies. And if we ever start to, there's panic there. So, for example, to use my style, as an adult, it would be to my benefit to look for evidence that dependency was weak or sort of not very desirable. I would see how people would get victimized if they were weak. I would look for evidence that weakness was a bad thing. I would have a style of giving and not receiving, because to receive you have to acknowledge dependency, that you have needs, you want something. Whereas to give, you can give from an attitude of not having needs yourself. I would have a tendency to place myself in life circumstances that required that I be strong, take risks, be competent, self-sufficient. All of that would be evidence that would prove every day over and over and over again, see, that's the right way to be. It's necessary. There's no question here. Personally, it wasn't until my 40s that it started to occur to me that I was an incredibly dependent person, which was quite a shock. But, of course, once I got over once I became used to the panic associated with feeling dependent, there was an incredible relief and a relaxation that came. So, in a therapeutic session, a lot of times there's this exact same process where somebody claims that they want to change their habitual patterns. But when we actually start to investigate what would be required, which is to feel exactly the feelings that that person has dedicated their life to avoiding, when that starts to become experientially clear, of course, a lot of very mixed feelings come up. And that's exactly our work at that point, to acknowledge and be kind toward, to value the truth that we have mixed feelings about changing these patterns. If somebody persists, they have to, in my experience, be committed to tolerating a fair amount of panic, at least for a while. And I have the opinion that it's worth that work. But most people are not going to choose to intentionally invite horrible feelings into their lives unless they, on one hand, are suffering so much from the consequences of their out-of-date formulas, and or are feeling enough emotional resilience, maturity, curiosity to be willing to risk those feelings. When we examine our neurotic avoidance strategies, our survival strategies, what we often find is that we are deeply aggressive to our own vulnerability. And we don't understand on an adult intellectual level, why in the world would I attack myself? Sometimes viciously, sometimes almost obsessively. I sometimes ask people, especially those with strong self-aggressive energy, a question: if you were a young child in a big room, 1 or 2 years old, and a parent comes in and you have a choice, the parent hits you or you hit yourself, what would you choose? Almost all people choose to hit themselves. Of course, they can pull the punch, know when it's coming, have a little control in a difficult situation, but I believe the major benefit is that by hitting oneself, metaphorically as a child, we can continue our hallucinatory experience of our parents being kind, protective, loving people, because they're not hitting us. Of course, metaphorically, that means we already have the clarity of our perceptions that our parents are limited, and sometimes severely so. But as a little child, 2 years old, we don't know we're going to grow out of our family in 15 years. We're living in a type of eternal time. And if we acknowledge the clarity of our own perceptions of our parents' limitations, we're going to be in really bad trouble. So most of us actually have an investment in making ourselves the problem. Because if I'm the problem, then that explains why my parents are not loving me as I need, because I'm the problem. And if I just fix what's wrong with me, of course, then they'll show up. They'll be there for me. But, of course, we have to make sure we never solve the problem of what's wrong with us. Because if we do, then it will become clear that it isn't us. We are, in fact, having to deal with very limited life circumstances. Parents, siblings, poverty, whatever. So that's just another way of suggesting that by the time we're adults, there's a lot of momentum in place where we actually have an investment to not solve the problem of our neurotic suffering. If we do, we will be at risk of having to deal in a direct way with the truth of our life. Historically, we could not deal with the truth of our life as little kids. We just don't have the capacity. As immature little beings, we rely on our parents and the world. If we couldn't handle our life as little kids, and we come up with these very solid survival strategies, it's going to take a lot of courage and anxiety to bring ourselves up to date and see if it's true that we can handle our life now directly in an unmediated way and take adequate care of ourselves. So when I'm working with people, I don't take sides with what most people claim to want, which is to sort of solve their neuroses, to fix these problems. Why do I always end up with unavailable partners? Well, obviously, that's painful, but that person perhaps doesn't understand that there's a function being served by always finding unavailable partners. It proves to that person that no one will ever be there for them, which of course means that their survival strategy of feeling, sort of being resigned to feeling unloved, to being ready to just take care of themselves in an unhappy way, to not having to have conflict with people because what's the point anyway, not getting our hopes up. All of those strategies are justified. See, they're not there for me. I thought they were going to be in the first year of the relationship, but they're not there for me, which is very painful, of course. But my particular view is that the kindest thing to do for ourselves and others is to bring awareness to our profoundly contradictory feelings about risking change, and to keep ourselves and others company while we go back and forth checking it out and reassuring ourselves actually by going back into what might be called neurotic experience and then taking a little risk and then going back again. So that seems very accurate and intelligent to me. The nature of neurosis could be understood in a variety of ways. Carl Jung has a quote which I like a lot, which is that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. Personally, I would say it's always a substitute for experiential intensity, because we all tend to contract away from, want to get out of not only pain, but also intense aliveness, sexuality, joy. One of the things I like about that understanding of neurosis is that it points to the view that neurosis is the activity of intelligence. It's not pathological. It's not some blind thing that just got put into place and happens to us, but it's actually an unconscious choice that we make moment after moment, where we say, I would actually prefer not to feel this incredibly difficult, vulnerable, disturbing experience right now. So I'm going to try to go around it. I will distract myself, I'll be self-aggressive, I'll get very activated, I'll get involved with parenting, with work, I'll learn to meditate and be calm, I'll exercise, whatever. There are so many ways in which we try to get out of our immediate experience of intensity. And basically it works in the short run. It's like taking a drink. If you're disturbed and you take a drink, it's a good chance you'll feel a little bit more calm. Or if you meditate, you'll feel a little more calm. But by getting away from our disturbance, we're not training ourselves into how to work with it. We're not making it go away, certainly, that pain, that intensity, but we are getting a little temporary relief. So neurosis works. Unfortunately, in the long run, it has a counterproductive effect on our life because we are not dealing with the truth of our life. And skillful means come out of dealing with the truth of our experience. It doesn't mean we're always accurate. It just means that's what we have to rely on, to work with. So often, by the time somebody's in their late 30s or 40s, they have this strange experience of a very thick, complicated state of mind. It feels very sort of heavy and sort of dissatisfying, but they can't actually explain that experience based on any current life circumstances. Everything might be going okay. I think that's usually the result of decades of avoidance of trying to get out of the truth of our experience. Again, when we were kids, that's very necessary, very intelligent. But by the time we are in our 30s or 40s, it's several decades out of date, actually. We have capacities as adults we didn't as children. The world is not our parents. So often people will come to therapy with a rather vague sense of dissatisfaction. And one of the understandings that we'll get to a little later is that rather than needing to address specific issues one after another, which is the style basically of Western therapy, it might be possible just to address the ways in which we maintain neurotic avoidance strategies in the present moment and return to our immediate experience, whatever it happens to be, whether we like it or not. But the developmental view is that we tend to address specific issues one after another. We might learn how to have better boundaries, better conflict skills, work on improving our self-image, things like that. And that's a very valid style. In my experience, it doesn't get to the heart of things so much, but it's a very valid, useful type of work to do. When we understand that we can approach neurosis not as wrong, but as our best out-of-date efforts to take care of ourselves, then it actually becomes, strangely enough, more available to work with. All of us probably have the experience that if we are dealing with conflict with another person and that person is treating us in a kind way and we're able to treat them in a kind way, we're able to work with them more skillfully. If we end up feeling like enemies, it's very difficult to understand their point of view, to feel hurt ourselves. So, of course, the more that we can learn to be kind to the ways in which we pretty much had to take care of ourselves, it actually turns out to be easier to work with these experiences, these patterns. So I happen to see the nature of neurosis as arising out of our clarity and vulnerability, not out of pathology. So we should appreciate neurosis from that point of view, not attack it. But when we feel threatened, of course, it's very common to want to fall into very biological, primitive, fight or flight responses. That's our biology. When we feel anxiety, fear, which is right at the heart of our evolutionary hardwiring, we usually drop into a very automatic effort to either get away from our disturbance or to conquer it in some way. In a Buddhist view, our fundamental aggression toward our own vulnerability, toward the truth of our experience, toward reality, is said to have three forms: positive, negative, and neutral. All of these forms represent fundamental aggression toward reality, toward the truth of our experience. But in our culture, we usually think of anger as aggression. But I find it helpful to understand that people can be aggressive to themselves and others in ways that look very positive. One reason for talking about these three fundamental forms of aggression toward reality is to understand that almost all of our styles arise from some type of aggression toward the truth of our own experience, which really means, from a developmental point of view, the truth of our emotional vulnerability. So I find that when somebody considers the possibility that they are being aggressive to their own vulnerability, it can invite some curiosity, and down the road maybe even a little more gentleness, because they can start being curious about what is it that I am attacking so strongly? What is it I don't want to feel? And is it actually serving me? Another possible benefit is that if we consider that all of us are being aggressive to the truth, then it's not just the angry people who are aggressive people. We're all in the same boat. We might even start to develop some empathy, or at least understanding, that all of us are sort of freaked out about dealing with life. We all have a difficulty, and we're all being very aggressive. It just takes on different forms. So in Buddhist jargon, the positive form of fundamental aggression is often called passion, or in Western language that might be understood as the neurotic feminine. And that style basically is to try to get out of disturbance. And from a developmental view, of course, we're trying to get out of this fundamental sense of being divided against ourself, split against ourself, because it's disturbing. It's a source of chronic anxiety and paranoia to have a part of ourself that might come out at any moment and threaten us. But the neurotic feminine, the passion style of fundamental aggression, is to erase oneself so there's no tension. So people with that style will tend to not assert needs, not have boundaries, always be accommodating, avoid conflict, put others first, and sooner or later will probably end up feeling like a victim because they're not taking care of themselves. The anger form of aggression toward one's vulnerability, toward the truth of our experience, is called anger, or in our language, the neurotic masculine. And that style is to annihilate what seems like a threat, what is causing our disturbance. So we tend to blame others, intimidate them, want to get rid of them. We might want to just not be bothered by people in general. Often we'll try to be self-sufficient so we don't have to deal with others. And sooner or later, that style can lead to the experience of being a perpetrator, because we're not actually feeling connected or empathic with others. In fact, others are fundamentally seen as the cause of our disturbance. The third form of fundamental aggression is neurotic neutrality, or ignorance, or ignoring. In that style, we're trying to get out of the tension of this fundamental experience of being divided against oneself, divided against life, by just spacing out, by pretending to be paralyzed or confused or stuck. And so a person with that style often will just sort of have a floaty type of presence and let other people, let life make their decisions for them. But it's very interesting to work with people with any of these styles, but especially with the passion and the ignorance style, presenting the possibility that these styles are actually, in their formulaic expression, are actually forms of aggression toward reality, toward our own vulnerability. So I find that often very interesting for people to consider. When we find ourselves in our maybe 30s or 40s, some people in their 20s investigate their young sort of developmental strategies, but often it's not till our 30s or 40s that these efforts to take care of ourselves that are out of date sort of run out of steam. What we often find when we begin investigating these sort of structures, this characterological organization, is that we have a very strong tendency to call ourselves and to call life problematic. So this will be discussed more in our next discussion, the fruitional view, but it's helpful, I think, just to consider that most of us seem to have an investment in claiming that there's something wrong with us. By doing so, once again, we don't have to actually relate to the truth of our experience. We don't have to engage with our life fully, because we can always claim, well, there's something wrong, so when I get it fixed, then I'll show up. Then I'll be fully engaged. Then I'll be intimate. Then I will go for my dreams. Then I will be fully embodied. Then I'll be whatever. But as long as we can claim that we are problematic or that life is problematic, we have an excuse to not show up. It's a type of protection still. When I'm working with people, when appropriate, I often suggest a homework, a little practice, that for some period of time, a month maybe, they drop any claim that there's something wrong with themselves, any complaint, any resentment, any blame, and just see what's there. And the usual response is, you've got to be kidding. How can I handle my life without complaining? There's so much to complain about. But when people experiment with that, it's very interesting, because they start to realize that their attitude of complaint, of problem, has been serving a function. So one of the points that I hope is coming through in this discussion is an invitation to consider the view that what we call neurosis is always serving a function. It's not something that we're stuck with from the past. It's something we choose to reinvest in, to find justification for over and over and over every day, many times a day. If we can become curious about what is the function that neurosis serves, we might find actually that we can work with the whole issue much more skillfully and kindly. Another question important to therapeutic work, of course, is the nature of change. How does that happen? Insight, relationship, cognitive work, behavioral work, all of those are very important, and different things work for different people. My preference is to approach change from the view of practice. I find that practice is the most reliable vehicle of change, and the attitude of practice can be applied to all of those other modes of change. In Buddhism, there's an organizing principle that's called view, practice, action. It's based on the idea that practices are most reliably going to help move us along in the direction we would like to go in. But, in my experience, the practices that carry the greatest potential for transformative change happen to all be counter-instinctual, meaning we don't want to do them. Basically, in the work of therapy, that means a willingness to go into exactly those vulnerabilities, fears, the rage, the horrible feelings that we've spent decades dedicated to never having to feel. Who wants to go into feeling stupid, feeling abandoned, feeling like they're going to turn into a monster if they let their anger out? No one that I know of. So, the view part of that organizing principle is a discussion, an investigation about all of the reasons why it might be to our benefit, later on perhaps to others too, but initially to our benefit, to do something so stupid as to intentionally have a relationship with our pain and our fear. So in my work, I happen to talk a lot with people at the beginning. I know a lot of therapists have a style of not wanting to share too many interpretations and sort of encourage the person to continue talking about their experience. My style is different. I talk a lot with people about a view, about what's going on, what are they doing, why, what's the benefit, do they perhaps have mixed feelings about risking change, with the intention that if someone thinks about their situation for themselves, not to take on what I say is a belief system, that would not be wise, but just if they can think about what's to their own personal benefit, they may find that it's to their benefit to do practices they don't want to do. When we do practices we don't want to do, another word for that, of course, is discipline. That's not often a favorite idea in our culture, but I find discipline to be essential as an attitude to address these very embedded, difficult patterns that we all enter adulthood with. In this organizing principle, action really refers to results. So we think about why I might do something, let's say in my style, why I might do something so stupid as to practice relating to others from a dependent energy, as if I'm a dependent person. That really is counter-instinctual to my style. It provokes anxiety. But the results then have to be basically what arises then in my life. Does it have good results to do that work? If it does, I might continue that practice. If it doesn't, I probably won't. So one way to work with the sort of very powerful momentum of neurotic organization, which of course is being maintained by choice at any moment, is to challenge that organization with a variety of practices that allow us to investigate our claim that something horrible will happen if I feel a certain way. So let's say somebody has abandonment issues in their history, and one of many styles that comes out of that would be to specialize in always being the one who makes connections in a relationship. As a little child, if you have a self-absorbed, narcissistic, absent parent, of course that little child can't be the one to introduce separateness into the relationship. They have to specialize in always trying to connect with the parent, to read their minds, cue off their moods, give them hugs so that they'll get a hug. So that style in adulthood often leaves somebody with the tendency to always be the one trying to make the relationship work. It's like they knew 90% of the work. As we said before, and we'll talk about later, of course, if my specialty is to do 90% of the work, my best choice of partner will be somebody who specializes in doing 10% of the work. But then I can complain about them not showing up for me. That justifies, once again, my style. See, I have to be the one always doing the work. If that person wants to work in the way that we're talking about, though, it will be very important for them to begin to invite conscious participation in their feelings of being abandoned, because that's what's true. If they can gradually tolerate feeling like an abandoned person, which is already how they feel, it's nothing new, they may find it's not going to kill them. It's not going to harm them. It's not giving them cancer. They're not becoming dysfunctional to feel like an abandoned person. It is not pleasant. It's maybe never going to be pleasant, but it's not actually harmful. This is a technique I often use in my work, somewhat informally. I've called it a worst fear technique, but basically it has to do with identifying the specific feelings, experiences that we have organized our life around trying not to feel, and then intentionally going exactly into those feelings to find out for ourselves, is it true that I will be annihilated if I feel these feelings? What bad thing is going to happen? Why am I continually dropping into this sort of survival level response as if some really bad thing will happen to me if I feel these feelings? In my experience, going directly into our immediate embodied experience of our fears, if it makes sense to somebody, turns out to be a much faster, more direct way to dissolve neurotic organization than to just address our historic issues that did, in fact, give rise, maybe, to that organization in the first place. That work is part of a larger view about what makes sense to me, which is how can we gradually, at a pace that is not overwhelming but is probably provocative, how can we move in the direction of gradually dissolving this split that we unconsciously maintain and consciously claim we want to get rid of? So one way of talking about that is to see a number of stages that we can go through in this work of dissolving the fantasy of being divided against ourself, or by extension, divided from life, alienated from life. The first step could be understood as waking up out of the trance state of taking our experience as if it's reality. We have to realize, we have to become aware that there are very powerful habitual patterns running a large part of our life before, of course, we can even work with those patterns. So the first stage is awareness, recognition, waking up out of just taking our experience for granted at face value. The second step could be understood as increasing our tolerance for those feelings, because we don't like to have that experience. That's why we have been ignoring it for so many years, trying not to feel it. But we start to ask, well, what is driving these habitual patterns? And what we may find, what I find usually, is that our habitual patterns are being maintained and driven by our attempts to not feel our core vulnerabilities. But they're already there. We're already living with them. So we have a choice. Do we work with the truth, or do we try our best to ignore the truth? In Buddhist language, our choice is not to be somebody different than we are, but really, do we relate to the truth of who we are, who we find ourselves to be, with fundamental aggression, where we say, no, don't want to feel it, or with fundamental kindness, where we say, yes, I'm going to say yes to this experience. I don't like it. I wish it were gone. But what can I say? If it's there, it's there. I'm going to say yes to it. As we start to say yes to the truth of our experience, at some point we start to understand we're actually saying yes to ourselves. But almost all of us begin with the feeling that our difficult feelings are being done to us. They're happening to us. Oh, I'm being made to feel like an abandoned person. I'm being made to feel, that you're not paying any attention to me. So the first step is realizing that there are these patterns. The second is to investigate and begin to increase our tolerance of this disturbance. The third stage could be understood as acceptance, where we're beginning to feel a little less panicky. We're more likely to say, yes, I guess I am a dependent person, let's say for me. I can't say it's my favorite experience, but it hasn't killed me. I guess I can accept that. The next stage actually is to begin to practice kindness to the truth of our experience. And this is where there's a certain sort of energetic, psychic center of gravity that begins to shift. Up till now, we've sort of reluctantly been acknowledging how we actually feel, what's really there. When we're ready to begin to practice kindness, we're starting to go toward our disturbance. And the big shift that happens there is that up until then, our disturbance still feels like it's bigger than us. So we're still trying to get away from it, or reluctantly relating to it. When we start going toward our fears, energetically, experientially, we begin to have the experience that we are larger than our fears. And that is a very important shift in feeling more relaxed, more confident, and so on. After we are kind to our disturbance, we actually practice welcoming our disturbance. We actually saying, yes, I want to feel this feeling. I want to feel abandoned. I want to feel dependent. I want to feel my rage. Not because I like it. I'm never going to like these feelings, maybe. But I want to feel these feelings because they're me. We're starting to get some clarity that all of my experience is me. I'm not actually divided against myself. I'm not a problematic person. Another stage, which is very powerful but very difficult, especially at first, is then to practice actually loving our worst fears, loving our vulnerability. And by loving, I mean that experientially, not intellectually, where if we're a parent, if a client's a parent, often it's much easier because I can remind them of what it felt like to bring unconditional love to their young infant. Maybe their infant was smelly, crying, they couldn't make it feel good. But they're still practicing unconditional love for that little infant. They're holding that child. They're not throwing them away till they feel better. When we're able and willing to practice unconditional love to our worst fears, we very quickly start to dissolve the fantasy of this basic split. Sometimes, for some people, I use the reframe that actually at that point we stop doing to ourselves what was done to us. We stop abandoning ourselves. Because every dissociation, every time we leave our immediate embodied experience and go into our interpretations, our drama, our story, our defenses, we've just abandoned ourselves. We've abandoned our own vulnerability. That's very painful, and it perpetuates our history. So every one of these steps of work actually represents a dissolving of this fundamental organization in which we pretend and maintain the claim that we are not a workable person. There's something wrong. There's something dangerous about who we are. As we do this work, we begin to feel more confident, more embodied, more open-hearted, more present, more engaged. We don't make our issues go away. We don't suddenly just feel happy. That's not the point. The point is that we have significantly moved in the direction of dissolving this young developmental organization, which served us well for several decades, but as an adult actually begins to have significant diminishing returns. The price tag stops being worth any benefit we get. As our attention becomes more relaxed, more expansive, as we stop being so self-absorbed with our claim of being a problem, then it becomes easier to ask a very interesting question. What is it that has been aware all of this time of this whole process I've been going through? This is the focus of the next discussion, the fruitional view.